Welcome to this panel dedicated to the theme, Gems from the Metaphysics of Community. This is Dietrich von Hildebrand's 1932 work in social philosophy.
1930.
1930.
Yeah.
1930. So this is why we have you here. Work in social philosophy. And it was, well, before we get into that, let me just say that I have two quick announcements which I was asked to give. The first is those of you who have not submitted your index cards yet with questions, please still consider doing so. We're going to be, in the break, looking over those with the faculty and presenting those during the closing panel discussion. What we find when people take the time to write things down is you see certain questions repeat, and so then we can give a nicely succinct formulation of the question to the panel, and we'll have all of the faculty on stage for that. So again, you are warmly invited and encouraged to do that. And please, if I would say by the time of the break, otherwise your question cannot be included because we will be making our decisions. In terms of the expression gems from the Metaphysics of Community, we've of course had Maria Fedoryka's presentation of the Metaphysics of Community. We've had many ideas drawn from the work in other presentations from you, Mark, and from you, Professor Crosby. But we had the feeling that even with the use of the text in these talks, there would still be wonderful ideas that were not going to sort of get special attention. And so this is how we conceived of this sort of final session dedicated to this book, which as you all know, the whispers have been that the book is being published. There were whispers for many years that it was being translated, and we are working with a wonderful translator who is the source of the selections that you have, and so we hope to be able to bring that to conclusion soon, and then the whole book will be available. But with those opening comments, why don't we begin with you?
Yeah.
If you could tell us a little bit about the how this book came to be in the first place.
Right. So. It appeared in 1930 in Germany and was written in the previous 2 years, 28, 29. And at this time in Germany, Hitler was rising. And von Hildebrand was extremely sensitive and strongly responsive against Hitler. And so he began as a philosopher laying the foundations of a fundamental critique of everything that National Socialism stood for. At the same time, there was the threat from the East, communism, which von Hildebrand always regarded as an equally wicked totalitarianism, equal to Hitler, and so he wanted to take a stand against these totalitarianisms, and a principled one where he as philosopher would go to the roots of community. And when, so it appeared in 1930 when he went to Vienna in 33, right after Hitler took power. He went to Vienna and allied himself with the German Chancellor and fought against
Austrian Chancellor.
Austrian Chancellor fought against the annexation of Austria to Germany. He at that time, 33, 34, 35, when he has his own journal and is perhaps the strongest Catholic voice against Hitler in Austria at the moment, and he then thought to himself, in the providence of God, I was prepared for this work by the work that I did on the Metaphysics of Community just a few years before. He felt that he didn't have the leisure to do the fundamental philosophizing that was called for, but he had done it a few years before, and he felt therefore prepared for his mission in Austria. Maybe one other thing of interest would be a friend of his who collaborated closely. You probably have not heard of Johannes Hamburger, but he was a fellow student with von Hildebrand in the School of Husserl in Göttingen at the turn of the century, and an extremely close friend, a dear friend. Hamburger never completed his doctorate, but left behind some very profound writings that Joseph Seifert is slowly issuing. And Van Hildebrand had such a high esteem of Siegfried Hamburger that he used to say to us, if I held a strong position and the whole world was opposed to me, it wouldn't bother me. I would stand fast. But if I held a position and Hamburger didn't agree with me, I'd reconsider everything. So this Siegfried Hamburger was one of the few thinkers to whom Van Hildebrand profoundly deferred. And it was a very deep, special, close friendship that united the two of them. And he was a saintly figure. He spent his last years in a monastery in Belgium. But he was a thinker who had a poetical strain in him, and he wasn't always easy to understand. And there are a couple of passages in the Metaphysics of Community that we think must have been written by Hamburger. They just don't sound like Van Hildebrand with their poetic flight and flourish. So anyway, that's a sign of extremely close collaboration. I think he dedicated the work to Hamburger, and I think he felt in some ways Hamburger was a kind of co-author. So let that be noted for history, that in the case of this book, Van Hildebrand had a real close, almost co-author.
He called him his philosophical alter ego.
Yeah, that would fit, yeah. So that on the book, its history, and it's the main collaborator of Van Hildebrand. Let's turn it.
By the way, it's worth noting that you said he had to give up his philosophizing to some extent in the Vienna years because he wasn't writing, but he continued to teach every semester at the University of Vienna.
Right, exactly.
So he maintained his philosophical life.
That's right, yeah.
Hello, thank you for being here. And I would like to talk to you about a passage in the Metaphysics of Community that comes earlier than the portion that I spoke to you about. It comes in the section where he's talking about community in the broad sense. And when I first encountered Hildebrand, one of the things that made me most enthusiastic was his notion of value. I sensed such beauty, such transcendence. It was so inspiring for me. And when I read the Metaphysics of Community, I discovered new aspects of his metaphysics of value, and just this idea of value as being the unitive element in relationships. And so what I'd like to do here is I'd like to look at 4 ways that the human person, 4 of many others that you find here, but just take 4 in this one passage, of the way the human person can be related to value. And I find it very beautiful and moving, and then 4th one I even find very delightful. So the first way that the person can be related to value, he says, is when some value that the person responds to takes up residence in the person who is being responsive to the value. I find this very beautiful because on the one hand, you see that the person is, of course, enriched by the presence of value in the person, but on the other hand, it almost seems as though he's saying that the value, in a sense, receives a kind of service in being embodied and incarnated in the individual who responds to him. And I find this very beautiful. So when any person is responsive, they're being responsive to a world that's beyond them, that's objective, that has its own being, and is sovereign. At the same time, it becomes, in a sense, personalized and individualized within the human person. So I would like to, as I go along, just read a couple of sentences with respect to each way that the person is related to value. He says, let us consider the becoming real of a value domain in the person who is directed toward it. This is a realization of a unique kind. If we speak of an artistic person, then we are thinking here of the peculiar realization that the world of art undergoes in the person who is sympathetically open to it and interested in it. He says, values in this case take up a dwelling in the person, and they extend their dominion over his person. We find here a certain embodiment of the relevant value domain occurring in a person when the person turns appreciatively toward it and gives himself to it as a value response. I also think of this relationship as a kind of adornment of the person. So it's as if values become like spiritual jewels that accrue to the person, but take on a very individualized form in the person. So the second way that the person is related to value is there's also the reverse. So when the person is subjectively responsive to some value domain, not only does the value sort of take up residence in that person, but the person is also taken up into the domain of value there. So he says, here the person is enfolded by the value domain. He is incorporated into it in a certain sense. In such cases, there is a weak analogy to what occurs in the supernatural realm according to the Catholic teaching, when one speaks on the one hand of somebody receiving Christ into himself, and on the other hand of being taken up into Christ. In this sense, the human person is typically incorporated in many value domains. And I think this is very beautiful because I think of the incredible beatitude that the soul experiences in being surrounded and warmed by the precious, by the thing that is good in and of itself. And he says for each person is going to be a particular and individual value. It's as if each person is given the gift of being invited to receive some value domain within themselves and to be responsive to it. And then they're taken up into it. And in some sense, you could say ensconced in it and warmed by that sphere. Then there's a third kind of relationship that the person can have to value. And this is where we see that community entering in, and specifically community in the broad sense of a relationship. So he says, and this was completely new to me when I read it the first time, he said that in the case of a love relationship or a love-like relationship, the opening to the person's individual uniqueness occurs by means of some value. So we gain access to one another as individuals in such a way that we begin to love them, and in some cases fall in love with them, only by the mediation of some value. And he says, when this happens, the person who is loving the other finds himself integrated into a world of value in yet a new way. And again, he says that the value that we discover in the other is not identical with that. He calls it the Gesamtwert, the value of the person as a whole. And he insists that this is what we love. It's the completely individual value of the person as a whole. And yet, he says it's mediated by the particular value that I would say, in a sense, is given to the person as a gift to embody or reflect within himself. And the one who loves finds himself breathing the air of that value. So another gift to the person. And finally, for the fourth way that the person is related, he says it's in an entirely new way. He says the persons who are in a love relationship, who have discovered one another in this way and have touched one another in this way on the basis of value, he says now enter into the value domain that they both participate in together. And here I'd like to read from the text. Just find my place. So he says, far beyond the incorporations that we've just spoken about, he says, we need to recognize the way in which every loving relationship incorporates both persons in an entirely new manner, in one and the same value domain. Every person has manifold relationships to other persons, and within these relationships, he moves in different worlds. So you think of the different friendships that you have. They all have their own quality to them. There's a different air in them. So every person has manifold relationships, and within these relationships, he moves in different worlds. So this is really charming, what comes next. Thus, for example, somebody has a relationship with another person in which they share various pleasures, tell jokes, revel in nonsense, are high-spirited, and enjoy the vibrancy of life to the full. To another person, he is connected in intellectual worlds. Perhaps they share the same scientific and artistic interests. He dwells in these spheres when he is with the other and directed toward him, He is connected to a third person, perhaps a priest, in the religious realm. So he says all of this refers not primarily to shared activities in a value domain, but rather to the connectedness to the other in this domain, which also shapes and forms the loving directedness to the other. I find this so beautiful that every relationship has its own inner quality, and you could say a tremendous gift is bestowed on the experience of the persons coming from the world of values. And as we know for Hildebrand, ultimately all values find their home in the being of God. So you can think of the beatitude that two persons have in being with one another, being united in this realm of values, somehow is a participation in the beatitude of God. So he says, as a final few lines, here it must be understood that in every instance of the interpenetrating looks, even of a rudimentary form, one formally takes up residence or pitches one's tent in a value domain in an entirely new way, in a way that goes above and beyond the other kinds of incorporations that we've spoken about. Interpenetrating looks that occur in a particular value domain entail a new dimension of incorporation compared to what occurs when an individual gives himself to a certain value. I love those phrases. The two take up residence in a certain value domain. They pitch their tent in a certain value domain. So that was all. Thank you.
So in my brief remarks here, I want to highlight two things from Hildebrand's Metaphysics of Community. One is a description of a particular kind of love that he gives in this text that is not really repeated in other texts. Many of you, I think, are familiar with his book, The Nature of Love, and this particular kind of love receives some passing mentions there, but it's not developed in any detail, and it is developed in detail here. So I want to highlight that particular kind of love. And the second thing that I want to do is I want to give a sense of sort of the overall vision of the relation among communities and the relations of the whole cosmos that Hildebrand lays out in this book. So we get sort of a big picture vision of how he sees the human person related to communities of all kinds. So first, to start with the particular point, early in this book, Hildebrand spends a couple of chapters delving into what he calls various kinds of classical kinds of love. That is, basic kinds of love considered in their fundamental essence, abstracting from anything sort of accidental or superficial to those kinds of love. And these classical kinds of love that he delineates, he lists, I think, 11 kinds in this text. They include things like love for God, love of parents for their children, love of children for their parents, love of siblings for one another, love of neighbor, love of friends, love for human beings just as members of the human race. And among these classical kinds of love, Hildebrand singles out two of them as involving what he calls a complete unveiling of those who love to one another, a complete revelation of the innermost word of a person's being. So in these two kinds of love, I totally reveal who I fundamentally am to another human person as much as I'm able to. One of these is marital love. And Hildebrand, of course, treats this in many other places, not only here in the Metaphysics of Community. Marital love is characterized, he says, by a desire to make the beloved happy through the gift of one's self. When I'm in love, the entirety of the beloved, her innermost nature, appears in a sort of epiphany to me and mine to her. For those in love, the other is entirely transparent, entirely unveiled to them. Again, and here we're thinking about this sort of love sort of in its essence. Of course, in particular love relationships, there will be various barriers and deformations of this. But if we're thinking about what is the essence of spousal love, this is the tendency that it has. What I want to emphasize is not marital love, but this other kind of love that involves an unveiling of the person. And he calls this thematic holy love. thematic holy love. This is the kind of love that we find between some saints. The example that he gives is the relationship between St. Francis de Sales and St. Jane Frances de Chantal. And in this kind of love, this love between saints, this love between people who are genuinely holy, the individuality of each person is totally revealed to the other. But unlike in marital love, this happens by loving the other with and in Christ. When St. Francis loves St. Jane, he fully sees and responds to her distinctiveness, not because he's sexually or romantically attracted to her, but because he loves her entirely as the unique person she is with and in Christ. This holy love unites the lovers, Hildebrand thinks, as closely as marital love does. And in some passages, he seems to think perhaps even closer, but in an entirely distinct way. Now, this kind of love can coexist, and it can even form the basis for marital love. That is, spouses can have this thematic holy love as well, but it's a distinct kind of love from spousal love. It does not have the sensory and sexual aspect of marital love, and it doesn't involve the same kind of self-gift. So even though it's a total revelation of each beloved to the other, it's not a revelation of the same kind as we find in marriage. Thematic holy love centers around loving the other in Christ and leading the other to Christ and being led by them to Christ. This is an extraordinary and supernatural kind of love possible only among those seeking holiness in Christ. But it's different than the sort of love that all Christians have for one another. It's different from love of neighbor. It's a very special and unique kind of love that exists between two genuinely holy people. And I think it's a real insight of this text that Hildebrand has singled out thematic holy love as a distinct kind of love different from these other sorts, and seen that in many ways it is even deeper than marital love. This supernatural friendship of the saints is a deep and classical kind of love. And if we don't grasp that, we have failed to grasp the full range of human love that is available to us. So that's a very particular point. I want to close my remarks here by laying out a sort of large-scale vision. And you see this vision show up in various ways in other texts. I think especially in the first volume of his Aesthetics, you can see this vision. But you see it particularly well, I think, in the second half of the Metaphysics of Community, and particularly in the epilogue. So at the very end, he lays out this vision of the cosmos. And I want to just lay this out real briefly by contrasting it to an older Christian and classical view of the cosmos. So in many Christian thinkers and ancient Greek thinkers, you have this sort of hierarchical picture of the world. So the hierarchy of being, right? So you got like bare matter at the bottom, and then like non-living things, and then plants and animals, human beings, angels, God. And so we've got a sort of hierarchy of being. As we move up the scale, you get towards more and more perfect being, more and more perfect substance. And also as you move up the scale, you get more and more goodness, more and more value. And furthermore, the scale of being, the hierarchy of being, has classically been understood as involving mediation, right? So lower things on this scale exist for the sake of higher things on this scale. Aristotle lays this out beautifully, right? Plants exist in order to serve animals and human beings. Animals exist in order to serve human beings. Human beings exist in order to serve God, but in some way, at least naturally speaking, through the mediation of the angels, the separate substances. So we have this hierarchy of being, this hierarchy of value. And Hildebrand does not disagree with this account, but he complexifies it in, I think, really interesting ways. Right? So he says, yes, animals, the world of nature, it exists for the sake of human beings, and human beings mediate animals' relationship, plants' relationship to God. But nature also has a value of its own that directly reflects God and directly relates to God, not through the mediation of human beings. So we have sort of multiple hierarchies here. It's still a hierarchical vision. It's still a vision that allows for this, range of being and range of values. But we have, instead of a single hierarchy, a sort of network of hierarchies. That's the vision, as I alluded to yesterday during my remarks on integralism, that's the vision that he brings to all of his discussions of communities. So communities are always hierarchically related. Some communities form the basis for others. For example, as we talked about yesterday, in order to have a nation, a culture, we first have to have this sort of thin kind of community he calls a circle of life, where we all live together in geographical proximity and so begin to take on communal relations to one another. But there are sort of multiple hierarchical relations here. The community, the circle of life exists for the sake of the nation and is mediated towards God through the nation, and yet there's also a deep sense in which the nation is dependent upon the circle of life. In marriage and family, the marriage, he says, is this classical relation of love, this classical community of love, when the marriage is formalized by a vow, by a covenant. This is the location where we best see, perhaps with the exception of this thematic holy love, but where we best see what it is for two people to love one another, and all other love relationships need to be understood by analogy to that. But then if we consider sort of our broader life together, our broader experience of life together and providing for one another's needs, the family predominates. The family is higher. So again, we have sort of mutual subordination, many different hierarchies, genuine objective hierarchies, but many different hierarchies of being, many different hierarchies of value, all relating up to God at the summit of each of these hierarchies. To me, as a metaphysician and as a person, I find this vision deeply attractive. I think it's one of the things that most interests me in Hildebrand, most keeps me coming back to Hildebrand. I think it's deeply rooted in our experience and the way the world shows up, and it allows for a sort of honoring of the complexity of the world that I don't find in a lot of other philosophers. So I want to recommend the book for laying out that vision in great detail. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for some questions, and I think we've got the microphones. So we'll go to Peter Mailander first, and then Arthur.
It's really, excuse me, really more an observation than a question. But Mark, just following off your description at the end of that, that kind of rich, multifold complexity of different relationships, I was reminded as I listened to you of something I'm sure you know, and you might even want to react to see if you see any similarities here. But in C.S. Lewis' Perelandra, at the end, there's this beautiful but really weird vision of the great dance where everything takes a turn at the center in one way or another. So you're not, you know it.
Yes.
Could you just comment on whether you see parallels between that sort of odd vision and what von Hildebrand is doing there?
Absolutely, yeah. So I just recently reread this text. My men's group read the Space Trilogy, for many of them for the first time, which is wonderful. There's this, Alice von Hildebrand, I think, would say to people, right, that how lucky you are you get to read something for the first time. So a lot of my friends read this for the first time recently. If you have not read the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis, go do that starting today. I believe it's for sale down in the bookstore. I think I saw it down there. So you can go get that. Yeah, so there's this vision. The main character is in the planet Venus, and the gods, Venus and Mars, appear to him, and they lay out this vision, right? A Christian vision, so these are sort of gods incorporated into a Christian vision of the world. But they lay before him this vision of the universe in which God has, is the source of all being and value, but in which every being takes a turn in the center. There's a definite objective hierarchical sense in which each being exists for the sake of each other being, not in a sort of vague amorphous way where everything is just sort of democratically rendered equivalent to one another, but in which there are a huge number of objective hierarchies where each being in a definite way and in a unique way is ordered to serve the other beings, right? And in which even God himself has made himself the servant of each of the other beings. Again, not in an amorphous way, not in a sort of totally equivalent and democratic way, but such that he too serves each being in a unique way. That vision that Lewis gives us, and which I think is sort of at the foundation of all of his fiction and his approach to Christianity, I think that's in many ways the vision that Hildebrand is laying out here. I think maybe Lewis goes a bit further than Hildebrand. This is the reason why I come back to Lewis a lot, again and again. But I think Hildebrand provides us maybe with a technical and metaphysical apparatus, which would allow us to talk about it in more precise terms than Lewis allows, even if he doesn't sort of go as far in the vision.
Arthur.
I have a question about our experience of value and the way it relates to community. I find often when I come across something beautiful that it's not enough for me to make some private response, but I feel as if I have to go tell someone about it, that it's incomplete until I've shared it with a loved one or a friend. And so I know these values have a power to unite us, but is there a way in which it's a feature of value that they not only unite us in community, but in some ways our experience of them calls us into community?
It's a very nice question. Yes, very nice. I wonder whether, I mean, this is great. Maybe everybody in the panel can comment. I'm wondering whether it coincides with Hildebrand's point that, but I don't think it does, that value actually opens us in our depth so that in that moment we actually experience a communion with other persons. But your point is slightly different, and the desire to share the value with another could be a new way, could be an expression of a new way that value is uniting us. But I still think that would be the unitive power of value at work. It's just maybe in a new way. So I'd have to think about that in connection with the text. But thank you for that. That's beautiful. And here too, it's a little bit of a reverse point, but I was wondering whether in Hildebrand, just the fact of sharing something, does he recognize that enough? Both the fact that sharing something can be unitive and also the need to share things, which already betokens a kind of longing for communion that seems to be present in us but evoked by an experience of value. And that's, I think, what you're pointing to. So anybody wants to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you read that beautiful line about how value, I have this experience of taking up my home, pitching my tent in the domain of value.
Yeah.
Right? Now, when I experience something of beauty, that's often my experience. Like, now I live in a new place, right? A new space, so to speak. And there's already people living there, right? Like, if I see a painting, like, the artist already lives there in some sense. And I'm already in a kind of community, or I read some new philosopher who really resonates with me, right? Now I'm living with him or her in that domain of value. And yeah, there's kind of this experience. There's already people living here. We're living together, responding to the same kind of value. And I'd like other people to be present here too.
Yeah.
Right? It's a home for many people.
Beautiful.
My question's a little bit more for Dr. Fedoryka. You mentioned these four different additional kinds of value. And the second one, the idea of sort of being taken up into some value. I found this a little mysterious. And I was wondering if you had any other examples, in particular, if there were any non-heavenly examples, something that one might experience here on Earth.
Yes, I think I can easily provide examples. If you think of something like, I'm just trying to think of a recent experience that I've had. So watching beautiful sunrises in the Northeast. And the value that one experiences, the aesthetic value that one experiences, and in the aesthetics, Hildebrand will speak about also a Gesamtwert, so a landscape will present a new whole. And when we are drawn up into, or when we experience that, we're actually drawn into the atmosphere, which, it's true, in a sense, it is somewhat mysterious, right? It's something that we experience in our soul, and we can make analogies, like you're swimming in the waters of something. But what's beautiful about it is it has a deeply qualitative character to it, so that Edith Stein says this in her book on community. She says that communities, the experience of community, can be deeply modified depending on the values that a community is surrounded by. So she says if somebody lives in a very harsh environment, the community itself is going to have a different fabric to it, and the collective experience is going to have a different quality. I think she's pointing to this phenomenon that somehow the qualities of the values fill our experience. And you're right, that is mysterious. It's difficult to put into words, but I think if we go back to our experience, we say, yes, this does indeed happen. And you could also point to the reverse, when you are in an exceptionally ugly place or something, a situation that's very degraded and so forth. Those negative values, and maybe here you can feel it even more, right? They somehow poison the atmosphere. And if you think about, sometimes they can stay with us for days and so forth. Here you have the incorporation of this kind, second kind.
Dad, would you like to?
Yeah, just one thing before it slips our mind to Mark's comments, that von Hildebrand complexifies these traditional hierarchies. That's well said. But also, it's important, maybe we haven't discussed it enough here, he reverses some traditional hierarchies as well. For instance, if you look at the account of the state, the polis, and the household or the family in Aristotle, the polis is in every respect superior to the household. That household is small, it's dependent on the state. So, but Hildebrand, by contrast, says in some important respects, the community of the family ranks higher. We're much more present as persons in the family, reflected, he shows, in the fact that in the family we call each other by the first name, whereas in the polis, it's more likely Mr. Spencer, Dr. Fedoryka, formal titles expressing a certain public distance. But the first name basis shows a greater personal intimacy. So persons are present as persons in the family. The basic moral education of a human being happens in a much more intimate way in the family than in what the polis provides. He says the polis has the tendency to swallow up smaller communities, whereas in the family there's no such tendency, no such collectivistic danger. So, it would be worth discussing more this traditional Aristotelian ranking of community of the public. We'll keep saying the state over the family. That is that's challenged by von Hildebrand, and there are other traditional rankings that get challenged in his approach to community. Yeah.
Thank you. Charles.
You read my mind. I'm uncomfortable with even the idea of complexification of hierarchy. And I know the inherited metaphysics. From our tradition, from the Anabaptist tradition, we fundamentally start with the priesthood of all believers. And we often use various kinds of physical expressions of our unity and equality before the one God that has poured his Spirit upon all. So we would not have necessarily, just as an example, us facing you. We would be in a circle. The Israeli folk dancing, where there's this rhythmic whole. The idea of a network that is not hierarchical, or even something horizontal where we've asked in a certain order that some people might lead us on the hike, but while others may be carrying the food that we're going to be celebrating together. And it's not a hierarchy, there's an order. And I just think this metaphysics of hierarchy is, I feel, the language, I think, undermines the kind of thicker community that we could possibly experience in Christ, where we are one, which he prays for. We are one in Christ, neither Jew nor Greek, rich or poor, whatever. So could you comment on that?
Sorry. Yeah. But from the authoritative position. Yeah.
Ex cathedra.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good. So I don't think I'm prepared. I don't think I have time. Maybe I'm prepared, but I don't think I have time to defend a sort of hierarchical metaphysics as such, right? I mean, this is a vast theme, but I want to make an observation in response to this. And I guess I want to offer some critical remarks about Hildebrand. Not the criticisms you've offered, but a different criticism. And this is that Hildebrand, I think, is a great describer of experience, and he's a great metaphysician. But he speaks from a particular cultural and religious viewpoint that he frequently does not articulate. So this is a issue that's come up in conversation. Peter and I had a conversation about this the other day. Hildebrand often writes as if the phenomena that he is describing just directly appear in everyone's experience and are obvious to everyone. And he does not, I think, adequately express the sort of interpretive standpoint from which he's coming, right, which is a Catholic standpoint. It's an aristocratic standpoint. And it's a classically rooted standpoint, right? A standpoint rooted in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. Now, none of that is to say that he is wrong in his metaphysics, but it is to say he's articulating things, interpreting the world through a particular standpoint, and that those who lack that standpoint, or come from another standpoint, are not going to see the world in the same way. Right? Things that show up as obvious to me from a Catholic standpoint don't show up as obvious to you. They show up as false to you. Right? So I think that this is an area in which the personalist tradition, or at least the Hildebrandian tradition, probably needs to do more work, articulating the interpretive standpoint from which these things are coming. Now, I would, I think, on philosophical and biblical grounds, defend a hierarchical view of the church and a hierarchical view of the cosmos and so forth, while wanting to retain aspects of equality and the priesthood of all believers and this sort of thing, sort of grafting that into a highly hierarchical account. I would want to defend that coming, as I do, from a Catholic and Greek standpoint. We can save that for another time. John? Maria,
No, I'm trying to see, are there any questions?
We have a question here.
Oh.
Thank you. My question specifically concerns Hildebrand's Metaphysics of Community. So you mentioned that Johannes Hamburger, sorry, I'm not saying that right, had influence on the writing of the book. Can you give an example of like a paragraph or something like that is definitely in his prose, and like how that kind of is different from Hildebrand's style?
Yeah, well, I don't have the German text in front of me, but I can find it, and I have the pages marked where he sounds more like Heidegger than Hildebrand, and where
Heidegger or Hamburger?
Where he sounds more like Heidegger,
Oh.
indicating the hand of Hamburger in the.
Hamburger was influenced by Heidegger.
No, but they both had this poetic elan. And
Do you remember, not the passage word for word, but do you remember some of the themes that come out of it?
not right now, but
I was wondering about pitching the tent, whether that's
Oh yes, right.
a more.
But Matthew,
That comes from the Metaphysics of Community.
follow up with me, and I'll give you.
Does that phrase come?
Yeah.
Well, see, that could be Hildebrand, but it could be
Biblical too, though.
it could be Hamburger.
There's even passages that are even more obscure, but I doubt are his. So, good. Thank you, Matthew. Sorry to have to postpone for a moment the full answer to your question.
JP.
First of all, thank you so much for all your comments so far. As we've been talking about value, both in this conversation and kind of at large, and its role in community, I've noticed this language of like the role of objective value, but the way we describe our relationship with it often seems more personal or closer to a personal relationship than the relationship that I have with objects. And maybe it's just my newness to the language, but I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit into that and how essential the language of objective value is, or if discussing it as more of a personal relationship could be more fitting in some contexts, or if something is lost by altering the language to personal relationship with value.
Yeah. Yeah. So in his aesthetics, for instance, Van Hildebrand speaks of the objective beauty of works of art, of persons, of virtuous persons, of beauty in nature. It's objectively beautiful. That is, it's not just in the eye of the beholder, it's not just relative to the viewer, but it's really beautiful. Whoever rightly, fully perceives this thing this beauty will find the beauty, it will break in upon him. He's not supplying it or projecting it out of his subjectivity. So he wants to, with the language of objective value, secure value, as something real, with sovereign being, autonomous existence, imposing itself on us and not being spun out of our own minds. And that would be the subjectivism of value that he hated and always fought against. Yeah, follow up if you'd like.
I guess in our relationship right now, you have this inherent value as a person.
Yeah.
And perhaps there's something analogous, not entirely the same. But it seems not entirely distinct when I encounter a really beautiful work of art where it offers something to me and I offer something to it.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of exchange between us that seems analogous to a personal relationship. And so, and perhaps closer to it than a mere object
That's right.
that has this value inherently with it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Maybe,
Do you want to add to that?
I was just going to answer in a sentence.
Yes. Do we have a mic for you? Why don't you quickly walk over there, Amanda, just so the...
Just in the same way we've been talking about individual and community, and the person is an individual in community, so there's this kind of synthesis where the personal relationship is where the individual as a subject makes a right response to the objective value, and that's the personal relationship you're getting at. So the person as a subject making a right response to reality, the reality is the objective value, that's the interplay between the subjectivity of the person and the objectivity of the value that is, as you put nicely, a personal relationship.
yeah.
I think it would also be helpful to distinguish at least two senses of the word object or objective. One, object or objective is contrasted to subjective. Subjective in the sense of merely a matter of one's opinion. So in this sense, object or objective means what's there in actual fact, what's there in reality. And that's the sense in which we're talking about objective values. The other sense of object or objective would be in contrast to person or personal. And there are other senses of the word object and objective.
And
Subjectivist.
Correct. Yeah, there are multiple senses of subject and subjective.
I'm sorry. Were you
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I wonder whether, John Paul, were you getting at another thing, which is that in some sense we normally think of persons as making a gift of themselves to another, a tree or a chair doesn't, or whatever, or a beautiful color or a beautiful landscape. And yet at the same time, you feel as though there's something like almost a personal exchange. Okay, that's what you were talking. I thought that, I suspected that. Yeah, that's very beautiful and very mysterious. Somebody like Simone Weil, she meditates on that when she tries to understand why it is. One feels that, especially in the case of beauty, that one feels that one is almost having a personal exchange. And she can only speculate. She says she believes it's because there's a person that is somehow making himself known, but not as person. And so you have a kind of gesture of self-giving that is being evidenced in the value. There could be other. We're talking about a very metaphysical question, a very metaphysical issue. But phenomenologically, I think you're very right. There's something very striking about the fact that we even speak of giving a response to value. Say, well, normally I only give a response to other persons. So why this language? And I think there's something very beautiful there. And ultimately, again, for von Hildebrand, I think it's true that it's God offering himself in every value. And can we actually grasp that connection cognitively directly? I don't think so, but there seems to be some of the elements and features of the self-giving of a person behind every value. So is that what you were sort of marveling about? Yeah. But I'm sure there are other good...
Well, would either of you like a final remark? Because we will otherwise, unfortunately, have to bring this wonderful session to a close.
Yeah.
Either of you have a final observation?
Oh, my. Well, just one more thought to John Paul's question. We all heard the Beethoven pieces, the Ninth Symphony. So von Hildebrand wants to say the beauty of that is really there. It's not created by me or projected by me. It's not existing in my eye as beholder, but it's really there and overwhelms me with its own inner plenitude. Now, there's the subjective experience of being deeply moved, but he would say the being deeply moved is motivated by this sense of the objective value. In other words, the beauty of the thing includes this autonomy, this being above me and calling for something from me. But so you've got the subjective experience, but think it through, and it's an experience that presupposes the objective value.
One might add, too, that in his aesthetics and in many of his writings, von Hildebrand wants to say that there's a sort of false association with objectivity and neutrality.
Yeah, right.
And that he thinks that the highly effective response to a great work of music is, in fact, highly objective.
Yeah.
It corresponds
That's
to
right.
the greatness.
And the detached neutrality is inappropriate and subjective, really.
Yeah.
And that value has to be understood in terms analogous to persons. As you mentioned Heidegger a little bit ago, right?
Yeah.
So Heidegger talks about how being fundamentally gives itself, and Hildebrand at the end of the Aesthetics, the first volume of the Aesthetics, after going through all the different ways in which every value has a sort of beauty, and so in a sense, since every being has a kind of value, every being has a kind of beauty, right? So sort of beauty fundamentally characterizes all of being. He says, the experience of beauty is one as if it loves me, not it gives itself, but it loves me, right? So the fundamental experience of beauty, and therefore all of value and all of being, is something analogous to a love relationship, right? Again, the marital relationship, or maybe also the thematically holy relationship, provides the pattern by analogy to which all other relationships with every other being and value must be understood.
Well, that's a very beautiful place to end. So thank you all very much.
Good.